Good day to you, and take a look, if you would, at the ground beneath that tree. Yeah, that ground and what goes on underneath it, it's really not that easy to observe upon first glance. However, if you were to dig down and actually do some soil sample tests, you would learn a lot about the particular composition of that ground in terms of nutrients and minerals. And those nutrients and minerals affect the tree in some very subtle differences, including the color of the leaves. So that's the way that we're starting class today, because we are talking about what this chapter calls cultural characteristics. Now, we all experience the interchange of culture. This drum right here is something that I brought back from Africa, Ghana, Africa, when I was working on writing this book. And is it integrated into my life very much? No, not really. Do occasionally I go in there and have some kind of connection with the rhythm that I can get off of it? Yeah, I do, even though I don't play drums. It has some kind of meaning in my life, otherwise I wouldn't still have it. But it doesn't have the kind of daily meaning that something like this has in my life, which would be English tea. Not my favorite brand, P.G. Tips. I much prefer the Red Label brand and some other ones, but still a good one. And so culture runs deep. And you have it in your families, your ethnicities. I bet you have something in your room right now that somebody's passed on to you, some ancestor of yours or relative from another country. The question for us before us today, though, is to what extent do the cultural characteristics of a country influence the eventual media system that we're starting to piece together as we go forward with the chapter? So we'll take on first in this chapter 4, cultural characteristics as a first basic element of a media system, the underground part that we have to dig into to get. And actually that term culture has a lot of meanings. It refers, for example, to popular culture. It refers to the culture of an organization. There's a lot of different definitions, but basically for this book, culture is how one set of people are distinguished from another. That is to say, how Americans are distinguished from Mexicans. And even that term Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians feel has been sort of taken by the United States as a sole possession when really both of these countries lay claim to being Americans. They are North Americans. So it's a little side diversion there for thought. So we're going to talk about how the different countries in this book, and I hope you will see connections with other countries that you may already know about, how they share certain characteristics and how they differ in certain characteristics as we go through different categories that break down this idea of culture. And category 1 is geography, and we're going to talk about France. And isn't it interesting if you didn't know that it's the second largest country in Europe? That's pretty big. The next one is going to be Russia. So France is really the largest country of modern-day Western Europe. But at the same time, it's bordered by a lot of countries. It's got a lot of countries around, like Belgium, Germany, and across the channel. It's got Britain, also got Spain there. It's got tiny little places like Monaco on the south coast that border it, Luxembourg, another tiny country. It's got a lot of countries surrounding it. Also, geography-wise, France has this really extensive former network of colonies. No, current network of former colonies. That's what I mean to say. Places like Guadeloupe, French Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, or a place like Quebec, just to the north of us in Montreal, or even our own Louisiana. The French have a lot of places, and some of these places you still get voting rights, like Martinique, the Caribbean island. If you live there, you still get voting rights in France. And that's because of the history of the French colonial period, with all those Napoleons going around the world with that big Navy fleet, conquering places, even like Mexico, and French were there. Yeah, that's where that geographical connection still comes to play. And think about it, that gives all of these countries that speak French now, because of that French colonization, it gives all of these countries a reason to have a commonality in terms of the language of the content that's produced, which is to say a TV show is going to be in French. It's got to be in French, and that's part of the reason that these countries are connected, because they have to look to each other to get French programming. Speaking of French, language is very big in France, very big. It's a source of pride for French people. They don't like to see their language corrupted. It's kind of coming from a former empire standpoint, because France And the French language was the prominent language across the world. Now, today it is still very prominent in terms of diplomacy. There are certain ways of reaching agreement with other nations that can only be done through the subtlety of the French language. At least that's the thinking. But it used to be a universal language that was spoken across the world as far as the most popular and important language. That fell by the wayside to English. But the French people don't want it to go away. So we'll find out later they, like the Canadians, they have quotas on how much media can come into their country that's English. And they sometimes don't let words come in either, like the computer. They don't say la computer. No, that's the ordinateur is the French word for computer. Very protective of their language. You can read about the society. It's got, the figures are a little bit older here, about 60 million people, and only 6.4% of those people are living in poverty in France. And it's a pretty low figure compared to a lot of countries in the world. French people, French society, this is what I'm talking about now, people make up a society. French society is known for being very artistic. And I've been to France many times and can tell you as you drive through, even the roads, each town has a little flower garden that you have to go around. Bridges are decorated with tile or painted, very nice. The rooftops are not just rooftops in France, they're very ornate. Paris does not allow satellite dishes in Paris, so it doesn't ruin the artistic look to it. France is just very artistic. It's one of the reasons that Paris is the most visited tourist city in the world. France is also known for being very political. French people, one of the first things they do is they just talk politics. And French are also known for being somewhat rigid in the way that they converse. Like I've seen a lady come into a post office there and she's like, she had to say good morning, bonjour, to every single person in the post office. Government-wise, France is set up because in a way to protect against what happened in World War II when it was overrun twice by Germany, or Prussia and Germany. Has a very strong role, the national government, in the policy and the protection of the country. So French national government is very strong, and so strong that it actually competes in the marketplace of media, that it produces content where they also advertise on that content. It's a strange concept, government content that has advertisements as a means of pushing the commercial media content, pushing it to be the best that it can be. It's a very unique combination of private and public media production that we will see throughout this course. Let's move on now to Sweden. Now, Sweden is one of only 5 Scandinavian countries. You know these Scandinavian countries if you... One moment here, I got a phone call, forgot to airport mode my phone there. You know these Scandinavian countries if you know about Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway. Those are the 5 Scandinavian countries. These countries, because they're so small, because their populations are so small, and Sweden is the one that we're talking about for this class specifically, is they feel that they have an obligation to their people to teach them another language. If they don't teach them another language, then those people have very limited opportunity within the small family of Scandinavian nations, and that language happens to be English. So they have English as the language that they teach, and they do that through their TV systems. There's a photograph in the book of how the Swedes very smartly, in my opinion, use a black bar at the bottom of a TV screen to have the Swedish, and then they play the audio of whatever TV program they're importing. If they're importing Law and Order from the United States, they'll let it play as it would be playing in the US, but they put this black bar, making the subtitles very easy to see, and people learning English at a very early age. That's why kids, young people, and elderly people all speak Swedish very, very fluently. And then we have the society, which is a population of only 9 million people. And this 9 million people still has a lot of traits, in common. For example, they value nature very much in Sweden. Difficult to find even a cigarette butt on the ground in Sweden, but even just people know about what's in the woods. They know which mushrooms are poisonous, which are not. The average Swede knows this about their country. Swedes are also known for being very open, and we will find this out as we study their media in this class. Very open with their media about what they will allow. They allow nudity, for example, but then being very closed at the same time. Violence is something that they are more restrictive on. We'll find out more about that later. Government-wise, it's typical of France, typical of England. You'll see a trend here. They are parliamentary democracies, which means you have many different parties. and then you have a party that's been elected, not a person. We have a president. They elect parties, and they all have to work together. And the governments often have more of a say in the way that media are set up as a result of World War II, which I mentioned earlier, and also because countries are smaller, more vulnerable. There needs to be less of a chance that things can go wrong with a bordering nation. So there's more centralized control in those countries, as is the next country, the UK, the United Kingdom. The geography of it makes it an island, right? It's an island, the UK. And the people have an island mentality. They don't think of themselves even as European. That's why they're withdrawing from the European Union. The federation of most of the European countries, or federation of most countries in Europe, belong to this federation, and the EU is pulling out of it through Brexit. Because, in part, it's an island mentality. It doesn't really fit in any category. It actually sees itself more aligned with the United States sometimes, but it is an island unto itself. It also has a vast network of former colonies, that it was even bigger than the French network. It was 1/4 of the entire world was controlled by British colonization at one point during the Victorian era. And also the English Navy. 1/4 of the world's population has been as far as Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States. We get our language from that empire. And then the Caribbean has countries. England was all over the place with its navy. And its language still binds these countries together, kind of like the French language. There's a place like Ghana, even, which was colonized by the British. Its primary language today is English. So it has a connection with England in terms of Britain, in terms of getting some media content into the country. The society is about the same population as France, so it's right around 60 million people. But some differences between France and England are Britain. I keep saying England. It's known for England, but it's Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland, and Wales. That's the United Kingdom, but England is the biggest by far. The society of all the UK is 59 million, 60 million people. It's known for having a class system that is still in effect. That's why the royal family is still revered so much around the world, in part because they are still part of an echelon of society that is still approved of by the British people. And then there are various levels all the way down, in a lot of the ways identified by the particular accent you have, dialect you have. If you know about a Liverpool accent, or if you know about a Cockney accent in England, you know what I'm talking about. There's a class system there. At the same time, though, there's a very high literacy rate amongst all people in Britain. Everybody reads. You get on a train going to London, you see people reading newspapers all over the place. You see people reading in pubs. You don't see that in American bars. You don't see people reading newspapers. And so they have a very high literacy rate. They can really talk about things. I've had conversations with taxi drivers over there about our Civil War, and they're educating me about the relationship between Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. Amazing what they are aware of. Their government is also a parliament, but it's a parliamentary monarchy because they have that very powerful king-queen system. Now we come to our country. I mean, we think we know about our country, right? But do we know that we are a big country, but we're the third biggest country in the world? Not the biggest. It's Russia, then it goes Canada. Our northern neighbor is a bigger country than us. And that one thing that makes us unique is we hardly touch any other countries. That we are, an island kind of in our own, maybe more of a peninsula. It's Mexico and Canada. That's all that we touch. So there's not a lot of opportunities for cross-border stuff, and especially in today's climate, right? The problems that we're talking about with the border. But we do have also a former network of former territories, colonies, etc., some from our wars or influences like Iraq or Afghanistan. We have presence over there militarily, so we also have some interchange. Is not that different from France and England in terms of those former empires. I'm not claiming that the United States is an empire. Our language situation is obviously we have English, but by 2050, there's a prediction that Spanish is going to be pretty much a close tie with English for being the most predominant language. That remains to be seen, but still, it says a lot about how important Spanish is and how increasing it is in our culture. And there's probably several people in this class who either speak Spanish or are able to understand it or have some kind of Spanish or Hispanic heritage. This is a society in the U.S. It's around 320 million people these days. And what characterizes us compared to other people, you know about this, you're probably pursuing it, is the American dream, the hard work, no matter what your background, you don't have a class system, you can become a successful person. Also, Americans are known for being very practical. We don't tend to like a lot of ornamentation, although that's kind of changing. But our houses, for example, a lot of them are just rectangular in shape, very bare minimum entrances, trees cut down. Now, that's generalizing, right? But it does speak to a difference with France, for example. Americans are practical people. We like our things to work. We don't like them to be that fancy. Also in America, we're used to stressing the importance of the individual. The individual it's up to that person. You can put a big private property sign on your house because that's your individual property. You have that right to it, and we celebrate the individual. Government-wise, we're a representative democracy. That means that we have politicians that we elect, and it also means that we elect, in our case, it's an electoral system where we elect people to then cast our vote for us for president. But in general, the idea is that we cast our vote because we are representing ourselves, even if we have to put it through a third party. Let's move on to Mexico now. Our southern neighbor, I have, as you probably know, quite a bit of experience in Mexico. Go down there twice a year and have done that since 2007. I also did some consulting for the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, the U.S. Embassy, and also for the U.S. Consulate in the Juarez City, as Americans call it, but Ciudad Juarez, as the Mexicans call it, right on the border there with El Paso. And my job was to go down there and share with them my research about journalism and try and conduct some workshops to help journalists there do some reforms in how they report. So I'll mention more about that when we get to news reporting in this class, which is one of our chapters. At any rate, it's a big country. Mexico, it's the 8th largest country in the world. And it's in between, geography-wise and also culture-wise, between South America and North America. It has a lot of characteristics in common with somebody who's from Brazil, from Argentina, etc. Language, for example, look of people in some cases, history and relationship with Spain, which was not pretty, and or Portugal, which is also not pretty, much like colonization with England, etc. But Mexico, it doesn't have that kind of resentment you would expect, despite the brutality that went on. And that's one of the things that comes out in its culture that I mentioned in this chapter is this relajo, this idea of humor to preserve dignity. When we go on a tour in Mexico, you want to go see the crocodiles or something, and this guy pulls up in this very beat up pickup truck, and you get to sit on the benches in the back, and there you are looking all around, and they say Mexican air conditioning. Yeah, that's funny. It's Mexico making fun of it. They're not going to have a limo there. They're not going to have an air-conditioned bus to take you to the... That's Mexico. It's all part of the culture that's coming out. Poverty-wise, we need to point out, though, Mexico is very high. 40% of people are living in poverty. I've been to some of those towns. I've seen sewage running through the streets in some of those small villages. You don't find it in the big places, of course, but a lot of Mexico, very mountainous country, you got 40% in poverty. Literacy-wise, not everybody can read and write. 92% of people, that's a lot of people who still don't. Other things about Mexico that come to light that will show up in its media content is outdoor street vendors. People living outside, actually. You can have a small place in Mexico because so much of your living is outdoors, so your expanse of space is really bigger than it seems if you just look at your house. And so you have a lot of vendors out there. You find this in Ghana too, selling things outside. And that opens up possibilities for little dining experiences and even bringing television out onto the streets with a cable because you can go out there every night and you know you're not going to get rained on. That's the way that Mexico is in a lot of places. Mexico's also very festive. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of loud music that comes with Mexican celebrations of things. And finally, Mexico's strongly Roman Catholic, more Catholic, some people say, than Rome. Just imagine that. And the Our Lady of Guadalupe is the key religious icon that's celebrated in Mexico, and you can see that all over the place, including in Mexican media. Our Lady of Guadalupe and that image, if you can see her, that shape, that oblong shape, is everywhere in Mexico. Moving to China now. China's also a big country. China is the 4th largest country in the world. 4th largest. I've been to China. It has one of the Earth's earliest civilizations. We sometimes forget that. We think communist China. China, you get paper, for example, that went on to make books possible. The invention of paper as a technology of communication was invented in China. We also know that China is kind of like other countries that we've talked about already. The U.S., for example, is involved in some territorial disputes. Mongolia, for example, who claims that? Taiwan, there's an argument about who really owns it. China has a lot of territorial disputes, but it's not really an expansive imperialist power like France and the UK have been, trying to expand and take over other countries, at least around the world. In its immediate sphere of influence, yes. There are a ton of people in China. I don't know what it's up to now, 1.4 billion probably at least. I've been in some of those big cities like Shanghai, and it's elbow to elbow people, and people just pushing through. You don't even say, excuse me, there's just so many people all over the place. Driving through Shanghai, I remember just driving for an hour straight and seeing skyscraper after skyscraper after skyscraper, and really tall skyscraper and really beautiful skyscraper at the top, crowned with beautiful lights and luminescent images all over. Amazing. It made New York City look very, very Chinese to me. So I really have to try and imagine how many people are in China. In China, the literacy rate is very low. It's 86%, in part because the Chinese, they don't have an alphabet. They have a visual depiction of images or pictographs we can think of. They're little drawings. There are 10,000 of them that you have to master. 10,000 characters, Chinese characters you have to master the written language over there. Can you imagine that? 10,000. We have, 26 letters in the alphabet? 10,000. So they have an 86% literacy rate. China is known, in comparison with the U.S. especially, for building business relationships first by building respect and obligation. So when potential business associates come into contact with each other, they have a very cautious approach to each other. They talk, let's get to know your family. Oh yeah, and what are your kids doing? What are they like? And your mom and dad, or where are they from? And your extended. It goes that way first. Those relationships are built up before you ever start to talk about business. Also in China, it's known for practicing holistic beliefs. Herbs, solving problems with people's health with herbs. I can remember having to look forever for some kind of medicine for one of my kids. I think we were looking for Motrin because there was a fever involved, and we could not find a pharmacy. And that's no accident. That's because in China, there's just places that do treatment in different ways, using herbs, doing tinctures, which are liquids. And even going around China in the park, you see the parks, you don't see them full of homeless people. In China, you see the parks full of groups of people doing Tai Chi. It's a kind of martial art and philosophy, I believe. I know it has a spiritual quality to it that people seek. And that's part of China's holistic belief system. And then we also know that China is full of artistic performances, and those are very highbrow in many ways. Chinese opera we'll be talking about. Calligraphy is a way of performing writing, if you can imagine that. Calligraphy, really fancy cursive writing. It's a way of performing writing. Think about that. Government-wise, this will be the strongest factor that we talk about. It's a one-party political system. There is no legitimate second party that should be in competition. That's the philosophy of communism. Communism is the only legitimate party. It has the people's best interest in mind. That's the argument put forward. China might be considered socialistic, though, and not communistic, depending on who you talk to. Socialistic, there's more free market involved in socialist economies. The economy is planned in socialist, but it's not as censored. China has a lot of censorship to it. It's somewhere in between those two ideologies. And so basically what it boils down to is you cannot criticize the Chinese government in any Chinese media. If you do, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. If it's a very severe criticism, you have a trial, you're in prison, maybe you get punished and sent away to a faraway place, fined, if you're lucky. China is very, very strict about, because the thinking is that communism cannot be challenged in terms of its legitimacy. If it is, it cannot function in its ideal state. And its ideal state is to try and provide equality to people and to uplift them in terms of their knowledge and their fulfillment of life. We'll say more about that in terms of media, how that translates to Chinese media later. Geography-wise, it borders 3 countries, none of which are English-speaking. Sorry, what am I saying? I skipped on to Ghana without realizing there. Okay, so I'm going to continue on now, and I'm going to move on to Ghana. We're going to talk about how Ghana is different. We mentioned earlier that it was settled by Brits, but also by Portuguese. It's got that influence too. It's now mostly under an English colonial kind of influence, formerly known as the Gold Coast, because it was originally a place where gold was mined, just like a lot of African countries supplying diamonds and whatnot. Unfortunately, to put it mildly, it also became one of the centers of the slavery trade, the slavery triangle, which was going, as I mentioned earlier, under globalization from Africa, many times West Africa, to the Caribbean and then back to Europe. But that also served to spread the language and customs and rituals and even drums like this one right here. You'll find in Jamaica, you'll find in Martinique, you'll find in the Caribbean, because that trade route, that slave route, spread culture and influences in media, like the reggae sounds that you hear in Ghanaian songs. That comes back to that trade route. Society-wise, 74% of people are literate. 74, that's only 3/4 of the population. Part of the reason for that is because some people are only speaking an oral language. There is no written language. They only speak an oral language, so they can't have a written literacy. So 74%, but it also means there's limitations on getting to those people through media. Can't get to them through newspapers. And it's got a high poverty rate, 31.4%. I can remember walking through Ghana and seeing poor, really, really poor households, at least on the outside, at least economically, right? Shacks made of corrugated steel that are as big as Americans' kitchen countertops, for example. That wasn't the norm, but I saw plenty of places like that, plenty of huts, I saw villages that did not have indoor plumbing, people still going to the bathroom on the beach. That's part of what I saw in Ghana. I saw markets in the city with people selling anything you can imagine, any part of any animal for sale in Ghana. And I saw a few places that we would consider to be very Western. I myself stayed in a hotel, but it's a country that's in poverty. It's a country that has not yet been developed, although a big oil deposit was discovered in Ghana, and that may change its fortunes, if you want to consider it that way. Nevertheless, in the present, many parts of Ghana lack electricity, roads, etc. You can't drive out there. You can't deliver something. What's that like for media? Ghana is still a very ritualistic, tribalistic culture and country. So it does have villages with kings and chiefs and tribes. And you got to get their endorsement to make any changes. Also, religion plays a big role in Ghana. A very religious country. On Sundays and Saturdays too, you just see places full of people singing gospel, and much of the television programming is full of religious sermons. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you have all these outdoor vendors in Ghana. If you drive across Accra, the capital, it's said that you pretty much have gone through a general store by the time you get to the other side, because you've been approached by people selling toilet paper, mangoes, coconuts, combs, nail clippers, you name it. All right, and that takes us to our last country now, which is Lebanon. Lebanon's geography makes it really, really vulnerable. It's a tiny country, very tiny, and it's surrounded by really big powers, and it's also in a location that's made to operate as a kind of welcome mat to the Far East. So you have these huge powers with advanced militaries, France, England, going to India, going to China, and they run right over Lebanon in the process. Tiny country, 28 miles or something at its width. And it's a gateway. It's been occupied by 3 different huge empires: the Ottoman Empire, which we now think of as Turkey, and then the French Empire, Napoleon, and then the British Empire, the Victorian era. Its language, it's Arabic, but French is seen there as a status symbol. If you speak French, yeah, you're a well-educated person. You have a certain higher class status to you. English is also encroaching. Becoming very, very important. And if you speak that, you also have a higher status as well, though not as high as French. American is another commonly used language. They do distinguish between English, and American English, and part of that is because of all the media that Lebanon is bringing in. Society-wise, there's only 4 million people in Lebanon. Only 4 million people, and like Ghana, high literacy rate, low literacy rate, though higher than Ghana. 87% of people literate in Lebanon, some would say because of those colonial influences that came through. But 28% of people living in poverty, 28%, more than a quarter. Why? The big story there is the Lebanese War. Yeah, the Lebanese War, a vicious internal war between Muslims and Christians for the most part, with a lot of outside countries around them influencing the war. Syria, for example, Iran, for example, another one, Israel, another one, which is still at war with Lebanon. It's a very tiny, vulnerable country with a lot of outside influences trying to influence it. And so it's a very weak country. It went through a long civil war, 15 years, long civil war, still trying to recover. But that doesn't mean that people don't have their own societal characteristics. For example, there's a politeness and saving face that goes on in Lebanon. You would not see people attacked the way that people are attacked in the American public media. Also, you have a very weak central government. So you can have a government set of regulations on media, but whether they're followed, whether the government has the power to enforce those regulations, that's something completely different. The power of enforcement, that takes a whole separate set of resources and skills and funding, and the Lebanese government has got other priorities, like overcoming poverty in its country. There is this TAFE agreement, though, in 1989 that brought the Civil War supposedly to a close. The TAFE agreement stipulates that all the major sects of the political parties and the religious parties, which you have religion and politics mixed in Lebanon, must be represented in the parliament there. So you actually have a certain percentage that have to be Christians and a certain percentage that have to be Muslims, and that translates also into media content and how it's created according to appealing to those audiences in Lebanon. And then finally, I just want to mention that in Lebanon, as you'll find in Mexico, and to some extent Ghana, the closer you get to the equator, you will find this, there's a more fluid perception of time. It's like promises are made, I'll do this tomorrow. The word for it in Mexico is mañana, tomorrow. It's the same thing in Lebanon. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, that's okay, because 9 o'clock in the morning, when it was due, will come around again the following day. It's just a giant wheel in the sky. Time is very, very fluid in these countries, and that also, we will see, affects the way that schedules are set up for media distribution in these countries where that particular feature is present. So it was a long lecture today. I appreciate you staying with it, but there's a lot to say about culture. Have a great day.